Hello, my name is Nicholas Allen, and as Director of the Wilson Center for Humanities and Arts at the University of Georgia, I am involved in the Coasts, Climates, Humanities and the Environment Consortium, which is funded by a pilot grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, for which we are all very grateful. The Mellon Foundation support has enabled researchers from the University of Georgia, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the University of Florida, and Louisiana State University to build a series of site-specific and publicly engaged research projects in coastal places, which look at questions of climate breakdown, community alliance in face of historical and contemporary marginalization, and the capacity of the humanities to imagine the futures of places under threat from storms and sea level rise. Our site-specific research has been interrupted, like everything else, by the pandemic. One of our aims is to create a series of online masterclasses on the subject of coastal studies. And given this is something we can do remotely now, I have asked a number of friends to take part in a series of conversations that we will share online. Some of these will be anchored in specific subjects connected to the consortium, and some, like today, will be broader conversations about the coast as a site of study and the diverse approaches that are evolving to engage with it. Joining me now are three colleagues whose work is foundational, innovative, and engaged. Isaac Land, Claire Connolly, and Willis Jenkins are connected by their deep interest in coasts, communities, and water. All are involved with their own major collaborative projects, and I appreciate very much their taking the time to be with us today and to share their perspectives on coastal studies in this era of climate breakdown. Beginning with Isaac and moving to Claire and to Willis in turn, I'm going to ask a series of short questions with time for some discussion after. After watching this, if you have questions of your own for any of us, please do email me, and we will try to continue the dialogue as the consortium moves forward. So, Isaac, greetings. Your scholarship and advocacy has shaped and energized coastal studies as a broad field of cultural engagement. When I think of the popularity of the coast as a subject of conversation and of study in the last 5 years, I think of your work. I've quoted myself in my own scholarly research, and I think of the wonderful ways that you engage with people through blogs, through conversations, and through your advocacy for the coast. So I just wondered at the start, would you tell us a little about how and why the coast has become so important to your work as a site of study?
Thank you. I did not use the word coast in my work for many years. I started off working on the 18th century and sort of in dialogue with Marcus Rediker's first book, Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea. And what Rediker did with sailors, especially in his early work, is he emphasized the unique environment of the ship and of isolation, of remoteness from the land, and the idea that the ship radically reshaped these men into something new. And so my approach was instead to think about sailors ashore, sailors in port, and also especially the women on the waterfront, whether they were working in taverns or as sex workers or as wives or in any number of other capacities. They were sort of imbricated with the maritime, but they didn't actually get their feet wet. And so the question is what to do with these people. So one approach, I think often with research is we just say, well, more work needs to be done. We just need to know more about sailors ashore or women on the waterfront. But what I began to wonder about is whether, if you like, my oddball topic that didn't seem to fit what anyone else was doing was part of a larger pattern or constellation of other oddball topics. So I started with, say, sailors out of place, sailors going to church when we didn't think they went to church, or sailors going to the theater when we didn't realize they went to the theater. And then I wondered, I've come to talk about this as sort of a vast penumbra. If you think of a sunspot with the umbra, and then there's that larger shadow beyond it, there's a whole arena of activities that are somewhat maritime or resemble the maritime, but didn't really add up. And I started wondering how many other people's projects fit into that category. So for instance, the history of surfing in the modern world is one that doesn't necessarily show up in maritime history journals, and yet it's undeniably bound up with the sea. And I started building a longer and longer list of these. And I came to call that coastal history as a term of convenience, but ultimately it stuck. So the Coastal History blog has been around for 7 years now, And it's served as kind of a clearinghouse to unite a lot of people who felt very isolated in the work that they were doing.
Sure. And you use the word penumbra, but I think of network and sometimes of constellation, perhaps also of charts, because these social questions have become geographical questions. I wonder, would you talk a little bit about your experiences of becoming to understand more the diversity of port town experience, these cultures of all of these different sites that you now have come across in the years that you've conducted this study?
So clearly it's going to matter what century we're talking about, what time period, what culture, and there's no one size fits all. I just got done blogging about Elsa Devienne's new book about the Los Angeles beaches in the 20th century. And so a lot of that is about zoning and redevelopment. Interestingly, Los Angeles, back at a time when the beaches were inexpensive real estate, there was this flourishing culture. There were gay beaches, there were African-American beaches. And as real estate values started to rise, a lot of these were sort of zoned out of existence, or there was selective policing to drive people out. So obviously, it's a big stretch for me with a background inside the 1790s in the British Isles to be reading about things like that. Or even to look at, I've just been in dialogue with a Canadian geographer who writes about seasteading and amphibious architecture in the current era, either as a response to sea level rise or these wild sort of proto-libertarian communities where people are trying to start their own ideal societies and make up their own laws. So it's sort of the intersection there also of technology and legal regimes. So it's been a wonderful adventure for me. It's been a great education.
Yeah, you're making me think of Anthony Adler's recent book and all of the fantastical societies that were also imagined underwater as well as by the water. Now, Isaac, I know many people who will be watching this will be thinking not only of the diversity of the subjects that you describe, but they might also from that be curious to know what has changed about your practice. You say that you started as an 18th century scholar. You were trained in certain modes of reflection and expression. And a question that's come up across several of these conversations about how, in thinking about these things, and not only have we noticed these phenomena differently, but the ways in which we describe them have changed. Has your language as a historian, as a cultural commentator, changed in how you describe these fluid networks of association?
I think if you had asked me 10 or 15 years ago, I would have identified as a cultural historian. My generation of historians in the 90s was very influenced, for instance, by Judy Walkowitz's City of Dreadful Delight and Natalie Zeman Davis's Fiction in the Archives. But I think even broadening things out, I've been much more in dialogue with anthropologists, geographers, people in public history, and even in the media. I'll just throw up an example. It's a bit of an irreverent example, but the BBC did a successful series for some years called Coast.
Mm-hmm.
And really, their approach was just to show up on the coast and film what interested them. It was very eclectic. But it's humbling and sort of fascinating to compare the sort of subject matter that was covered on BBC Coast with, for instance, what appears in the International Journal of Maritime History, because there's almost zero overlap in the subject matter at all. And so it really, I think the beauty of interdisciplinary dialogue is that many of us are stuck. We don't know we're stuck, but the interdisciplinary conversation can get us unstuck and get us imagining different source material, different research questions in new ways.
I've never thought of you as being stuck, Isaac, I must say. And I really admire the way in which you have traveled amongst all these different fields. And before we move on to Claire and the work that she has done between coasts, especially around the Irish Sea, I wondered, I know you've been working a lot on the formation of new journals, of new ways in which this evolving language can be represented. I wonder, in not only talking about the past, but thinking about the future too, have you any idea of what a coastal studies might look like in 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now?
So we drew together the proposal for the new journal, and one thing that really struck me is that some thinkers on the coast who I admire a great deal, such as John Gillis and Michael Pearson, tend to describe the present day coast in many ways as a dead site, as the remains of something that has been destroyed. Sort of treating resorts and cruise ships as almost like a burial ground where living communities once stood. And one thing I've really been arguing for very aggressively is to say this right now is the most live period of the coast because of air conditioning and technological change. More people live on or near the coast than ever before, with unfortunate consequences in an era of sea level rise. But it's not just sea level rise. If you think about waterborne migrants, who were called rather pejoratively when I was younger, boat people, coming from Vietnam, coming from Cuba, more recently in the Mediterranean, and out of Indonesia towards Australia, this is one of the most urgent issues of our entire era, something that's unfolding on beaches. So I think this intersection of environmental crisis, sea level rise, coastal urbanization, and waterborne migrants actually shows that the humanities and the social sciences it's never been more necessary that we step forward and develop a vocabulary to actually talk about the coast.
Thank you, Isaac. Now, Claire, you're one of Ireland's most distinguished literary critics. You've just been involved in this great set of Cambridge histories to do with the deep account of Ireland's literature over time. I've been familiar with your work for a long time. And again, I suppose like Isaac, it's interesting with the two of you, I hadn't thought of it before, I had this correspondence in the 18th century when I think about Swift and the work you've done about his difficulties in traveling between Ireland and elsewhere. So I wondered, you were involved at the moment in this major research project, which in a way goes through these places which may have been neglected, which are these coastal ports that join Ireland to the coast of Wales. But I wondered, would you again, a little like Isaac, before we get there, and tell us a little bit about how water and coasts came to be important to your work?
Yeah, thanks, Nicholas, and thanks for the opportunity to join this conversation. Like Isaac, I began in a discipline, so as a literary scholar, and one, I suppose, in the case of Irish studies, that's particularly formed around questions of land and soil. The rhetoric is so strongly present, and yet, of course, always experienced on coasts and thresholds and shores and bridges and ferries and harbours and so on. So in a way, I think just the sheer kind of accumulated material history of crossings on and off the island has to kind of bear in upon you at some point, I think. And I also, like Isaac, was interested in moving between and across disciplines always, and water, of course, and coast quite naturally sort of lead you in that direction, and that's attractive as well. But I suppose also the kind of indeterminacy and the fluidity around the idea of water and coast is also kind of engaging and attractive. I mean, what is a coast? When I started working on the project that you refer to, which is so the project I worked on before, which is to do with the West Cork coast, a stretch of the southwest coast of Ireland, we had cause to kind of contrast the EU definition of a coastline with the US definition, with indeed the definition that most people who live on that coast would adopt. And scaling between those definitions was moving across, really quite significant distances. And in the end, we adopted, I suppose, the broadly community-led definition of coastline, which is 5 kilometers from the sea. In the case of this particularly rocky and inundated coastland, whereas the EU definition would push you further and the US one further still inland. Or, when we say, if you look up these definitions, they say a coast is a strip of land that, you immediately wonder, well, isn't a coast a strip of sea as well? And one of the kind of things that got me thinking about this was I was doing a little bit of work on a great 19th century Irish poem, you'll know it, Nicholas, by James Clarence Mangan, called The Lament Over the Ruins at the Abbey at Chockmulliga. It's a little in the mode of, say, Tintern Abbey, thoughts arise in relation to looking at a coastal ruin, a ruined monastery. And I read one of the sort of classic accounts of this poem by the scholar David Lloyd, who was kind of talking about the many ironies in the poem. And the poem begins with a note to the Ordnance Survey of Ireland and says, if you're wondering, where this coastal spot is, look at the Ordnance Survey, go to the map. And Lloyd looks at this and he says, and among the many ironies here is the fact that this place called Timoleague isn't even on the coast. And I thought about this and I thought, well, it is rather on the coast. The monastery is washed by the waves. And then I thought, well, it is on an estuary. It's quite a deep, long estuary. And in the period of the writing of the poem, that had become quite silted up and was no longer used for trade and so on. And so that kind of, and maybe it was a mistake, or maybe it was a sort of, the very questionability and debatability of what coasts are, which take you into environmental history, social history, political history, sort of drew me into the topic.
Yeah, we had a great conversation last week with Ryan Emanuel, who's a water scholar and a member of the Lumbee tribe and a kind of a famous scientist here in the States. But he was just saying actually about his experience of rivers and about the ways in which whenever he goes into the open sea that he sees everything different and actually almost feels uncomfortable because the scale has opened up in a way that he is so used to being surrounded by a kind of tree and swamp-like habitat. Now, you've been very good also. I mean, one of the things I admire about you very much is that the way in which in thinking about these questions, and both Isaac and you have used the word we a lot. There's a real sense not only of engaging with what the community understand to be the coast, but also in creating a community of scholars. And I wonder, would you say something briefly about the way in which you have worked with a community of early career researchers to apply their new skills to the work and questions you've been thinking about? And that would happen, I think, both with Deep Maps and that wonderful exhibition that you had in the Glucksman Gallery in Cork, and then perhaps a little bit about the work you're doing between Ireland and Wales at the moment.
Working with some of those early career scholars is just simply one of the great privileges of my working career. Before I say more about that, I suppose one thing that influenced me when I started thinking about all of this was there was a little forum in that journal, Environmental History, a few years ago, maybe 2012, 13, about opportunities for marine environmental history. It was led off by an article by Jeffrey Bolster. And one of the things that was kind of emerging through these debates, often which were very site-specific case studies and so on, was the idea that not only did this kind of work, environmental history, need dialogue between and across the disciplines, and that just seemed essential, and it immediately brings in somebody like me and allows me to talk to colleagues in folklore or Irish, or, indeed in the case of Deep Maps, I worked with a colleague in marine biology, but also that kind of interdisciplinary dialogue itself then calls up and requires a model of kind of shared authority with coastal communities themselves. And so the idea of interdisciplinarity in the coastal context, I think, and perhaps in all contexts, interdisciplinarity in the coastal context simply doesn't work properly or embed itself or get anywhere near to developing, kind of getting close to its goals, unless that model of shared authority with coastal communities can be developed. And that's, of course, delicate and evolving. And it's also not about sort of just paying lip service to that, but finding practical ways of doing that. So an example in relation to the West Cork project would be the fact that one of the things we discovered was some of the most beautiful early images of the West Cork coast are in the British Library, in the King's Topographical Collection. Some of you will know that resource, and they're difficult to access. You have to pay still to get full quality images of them and so on. They're not part of the great open access moment. But we were able to get that access, put them on our website, and sort of, as it were, repatriate them digitally to their communities and their contexts in ways that I think are meaningful to people and make a difference. And to go back to the question about working with early career scholars, it means working with people who know how to do that kind of stuff and are up to date with digital resources. So in the case of Deep Maps, I worked with Dr. Rachel Murphy, who led the GIS aspect of that project. Some of you again will know her from Twitter. She's teaching at the University of Limerick at the moment, and currently working with Dr. James Louis Smith, who's also a digital humanist, whose own water project on Lough Derg has proved a kind of a model for lots of people. So I just think, I suppose there is something kind of inherently collaborative in these topics, and we're not working unless we're working collaboratively.
And you're working collaboratively on a larger scale again now with this European Union funded grant that you have between Wales and Ireland at a time whenever the UK is floating apart as an island in the European Union. So you picked an interesting time to negotiate these places, and I
the floating Commonwealth idea has never seemed more interesting. Yeah. You know, there's one of the great Celtic scholars, Nora Chadwick's, described the Irish Sea as a great landlocked lake, she said, the true unit of Celtic civilization. And we have been in danger, I think, of leaving those thoughts and that observation to the Celticists, who, of course, have their own wonderful kind of ways of thinking and talking about this. But to track those connections between and across the Irish Sea into modernity is really significant, not least in the context of the economic challenges faced by the port communities. Another postdoctoral researcher that I'm working with at the moment, Jonathan Evershed, has described the port communities as new kinds of frontiers, in a way, frontier communities in the era of Brexit. And so we're trying to find ways of retelling the stories of the ports so that their heritage might cause some people who are simply passing through the ports to stop, spend some more time there, maybe some money as well, and engage with these communities. One of the things that struck me listening to Isaac is how there is this tendency to sort of think of ports, docklands, waterfronts as the kind of unpicturesque side of coastal life or coastal communities, and to reserve the term coasts for sort of pristine, perfectly preserved our natural heritage and so on. But the truth is, as we all know of our coasts, whatever the scale is, the reality is often much more mixed and shifting.
Yeah, and before I move to Willis, where I think of this question that you describe about how we understand the word coast and what resonances it has in our imagination. Just thinking now also about this project, and I'm thinking a little bit about Holyhead, a place you've been interested in for a long time. This feeling of being becalmed that we all have, of a pause that this pandemic has introduced. And yet the places like Holyhead that you are working upon are places that I've always tried to get through as quickly as possible, because that's kind of the conditioning of travel in this regard of where you're coming from. So in paying attention to them, and for people who will be watching this conversation, if you were to iterate now a place like Holyhead in this cultural, contextual, shifting, mixed landscape, with the many years of scholarship and experience you have behind you, how would you describe such a place to us? One of these port places in a way that might be different from how you would have described it before?
I'll tell you a quick story, which is partly to do with engaging with the coastal communities. I have often travelled through Fishguard in West Wales, which has a connection, has had since the late 19th century with Rosslare on the Wexford side of Wexford on the Irish side of the coast. And there's a sort of a place where your car pulls in and you wait to board the ferry, and you have a 4-hour crossing across the Irish Sea. I must have done it, I won't even say hundreds, I may have done it thousands of times. And one of the people that we're working with in Fishguard recently sent us a photograph of a Viking fish trap, which you can see when the sands are low, unveils itself twice a day, and the marks of the stones are still incredibly visible. The history of it is known there and is really interesting. And if I had ever once stepped out of my car and gone and looked over at what the tide was right, I would have seen the Viking fish trap and maybe found out more and learned more about that coastal community. But somehow I never did. Or if I got out of my car, I was to head for coffee, So I just think that sort of there is time to be spent waiting, and there's probably better ways to spend it than we sometimes do.
Yeah, so I was thinking ideas. I suppose the ferries are timed for the full or the rising tide, and so again,
Exactly.
the kind of the cultural geography doesn't always coincide with the
Yes.
environmental, the commercial. Thank you. But it's a really wonderful project, and I know everyone will enjoy hearing about how it evolves over the years. Now, Willis, it was a pleasure to welcome you here in Athens earlier in the spring. Now it now seems 1,000 years ago. You break the mold to some degree, which is that you are a theologian working with a musicologist, whereas many of our conversations have been informed by disciplines like literature and history. And before we come to talk about your work on the Virginia coast, I wonder, would you explain to us in some general sense of how the idea of the coast or being by the water became important for you in your work, which is very globally and theologically and environmentally inflected?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Thank you for inviting me. There's certainly nothing in my research background that would suggest that I have, that I should be allowed to say anything about thinking of coasts. But the story is actually important to what I value most about it. So University of Virginia, it directs this NSF-funded long-term ecological research site on the eastern shore of Virginia. It's this incredible place in that it's the largest undisturbed barrier island system in the world, and so has served for 30 plus years as a laboratory for seeing how coasts without much human intervention, how they function, and especially how they function in accelerated change. So there's this amazing research site, lots of scientists work there, and no one at the University of Virginia in the Humanities and Arts knows anything about it. And the director of this place and I were having a conversation about, just generally about how the humanities might be more involved with what the environmental sciences were doing. And we thought, well, let's just create a little experiment at this place. Like, what would it look like to integrate arts and humanities in this place alongside of the science-based work, maybe in ways that can enhance public engagement? I mean, the scientists, as many scientists are always interested and a little bit frustrated about how they're about reaching out and making their research more meaningful to communities. And so it was really that ad hoc that 3 or 4 years ago we got together a pilot of people who might be interested brought them on a field trip, and undertook some kind of weird listening exercises with a musician, and amazing collaborations took off. And I should just say that I have been extraordinarily lucky to have open, generous, creative collaborators. So the ecoacoustic musician Matthew Bertner, extraordinary, and the coastal scientist Karen McGlathery are my co-directors in this endeavor we call the Coastal Futures Conservatory, which has been seeding arts and humanities experiments around this site for about 3 years. But that's a long way of saying, basically, I have been over the last few years quickly reading all of this coastal scholarship in order to be able to be a contributor to our little project. And and maybe I'll just stop there and say that it's an accidental interest and then suddenly it becomes this fermenting, creative, generative site for other kinds of interests that I have, which is, and my interests very broadly are about how moral communities make sense of environmental change.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, I loved you had a story that you shared, if you don't mind again now, about the ways in which scientists perhaps weren't entirely convinced that listening was a useful function by the coast. Am I right? That whenever you...
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so on this first little pilot, we brought the chair of the environmental sciences department and the director, Karen McGlathery, of the research center, and a couple other senior humanities scholars. And Matthew and I had sat around and we had created a sequence for our field trip that included a number of some discussion of texts and just exchange of research. But we were going to start off by listening, but he was going to create a listening station, and we were just going to listen to a mudflat for 30 minutes. And this seemed like a really good idea when we were talking, the two of us. But when we got out in the mudflat and I saw these scientists and what we were asking them to do, and I saw these, senior humanities scholars, and I just thought, oh no, like they're gonna think this is what happens. This is exactly what happens when you invite the humanities in. You get these like super squishy, weird feeling kinds of exercises. And so I had a very non-contemplative 30 minutes myself while I was worried about what was going to happen. And the most amazing thing happened. The director, Cameron Glathery, came back and she said, all of my researchers need to do this. And she said she had actually been a little bit grumpy and impatient with the whole idea of the field trip, but she had experienced the environment that she studied for decades in a new way. She was attendant to new kinds of phenomena. And really the only thing we had done was to set a kind of threshold and ask people to be non-expertly open to it. And they came, and we didn't take apart our experience, but that experience became a kind of platform in which we could have more expert-based collaborations around the coast. And then that's become foundational to our practices, that we always have a listening exercise that opens our lab meetings.
And that has had some unusual consequences in terms of the coastal economy too. There's a wonderful connection between oyster farming and your use of sonic materials. Would you mind sharing?
This actually gave rise to new science right off the bat. So another thing we did is we dropped a hydrophone down onto an oyster reef, and there's long-term study about oyster reef restoration at the Virginia Coast Reserve, all kinds of knowledge based around it. And when I came back to UVA and I gave a presentation to some other researchers just trying to get them interested in this, one of the scientists who was studying oyster reefs, he heard our recording, and it just raised a question. He was like, "Oh, well, I wonder if there are acoustic signatures of the kinds of phenomena that I'm trying to study." And so then we funded a collaboration between a music graduate student and an environmental science graduate student, and sure enough, they found acoustic signatures of oyster reef health, which is interesting for a couple ways, both like as a way of measurement, but then also about how the reef itself is responding to its sonic environment, and are there other sounds that are basically good or bad for oyster reef development. So that was fun, and it also showed the way that an odd way in, an arts-based way in, can give rise to normal science, right? To new kinds of expert questions. It was a way of honing acuity. So that's been fun. And then I just want to say one more thing about that. So the data that we have around oyster reef restoration, then we've also worked to sonify it so that you can hear these long-term data sets. So we create installations for publics, especially on the Eastern Shore, where they can hear an oyster reef, and then they can hear the long-term data about that oyster reef. And then even next stage, we've created performances in which there's a musical expression that works with the actual field recording, plus the data, plus we're all on stage. Even me, I've like no way that I should be on a music stage, but the idea is that you have a humanist and a scientist and an artist up there, and we're performing something about the coast together. And the response to these has been really wonderful and open and generative, and folks on the Eastern Shore have asked for these installations. There's now one in the hospital. We set one up in the museum, and now there's one in the hospital and one in a school.
Well, tell me the one about the hospital and school, if you don't mind, and then I want to come back and ask you about community a little bit more.
Yeah, so there's a place called the Barrier Island Center, which is a museum for the Eastern Shore communities, and it's really dedicated to I guess I would say the lost white settler culture that was on these barrier islands and then retreated in the face of change in the 1930s and 40s. And so there's a museum that's dedicated to that, which is really interesting in a contemporary time of accelerated coastal change, because there's this meditation on a previous significant cultural disturbance. So in this place that is dedicated to remembering these barrier island communities, we created just little listening stations just inside of their exhibits, with just a single piece of paper about what they were hearing and the science behind it, and maybe one sentence on the broader pattern that it was giving expression to. And there were 8 of these installations, and we had a public opening, and people came, and it was a wonderful response to it. The communities really loved it. It was covered in the papers. And then, yeah, sure enough, then the hospital reached out to the research director of the Coastal Research Station and they asked for the installation to be permanently housed there. And it's also inflected how the research center runs programs for school children. Again, just I think it's a way into data that by lighting up a different kind of sensory capacity also lights up different ways or opens and affords different ways of understanding.
I think this is why I find these coastal conversations so fascinating and provocative and really enriching over these past number of years. Not only is the community itself so open, I think because it's emerging to conversations between all kinds of people who have all kinds of interests in all kinds of places, but what has emerged this morning, even in our conversation, which is not what I expected to really, is this idea of community. It must be admitted that some of Isaac's communities are immoral communities. If Willis, you are interested in moral communities when we think about sailors ashore in the 18th century or the Barrier Island hospitals and school. So I wonder, just as we come to a close with some general conversation, if we've thought about the coast as a place of liquid and fluid association, and if we think about these major, seemingly intractable problems of climate breakdown, of coastal movement, of the challenges of rising seas, of economic hardship, of political transition like Brexit, as was mentioned. Is there anything in this discourse of the coastal that we could look to, which, if not provide an answer, is not only changing models of how we think about coastal places, but about how coastal places might continue to help us think differently about the future? If you think a little bit about the experiences you've had, some of them you've already described, about how you can imagine different futures through coastal communities, futures you might previously have thought of, and thinking about that. And Claire, perhaps you'd like to say something about land and soil tradition you talked about of Ireland.
I mean, it's a really difficult question to answer, and one would have to be careful not to sound pat in relation to these issues, but I suppose fragility is really important, and the inherent fragility of coastlines, which is so horrifically enhanced in our current moment of rising seas. But something that struck me when both Isaac and Willis was speaking was the kind of question of expertise. And in a way, the coastal problem models a sort of wider social problem at the moment about both embracing expertise, but being able to lay it aside. And that's a really delicate thing to do. And again, I think one cannot simply do it across disciplinary walls within a university. One has to do it in wider conversations with coastal communities. And I absolutely loved Willis's examples of that, of the kind of laying aside of expertise that then generated new kinds of knowledge. And I think that is the model to go for. And if I have a sort of a worry about how this works in interdisciplinary terms, I think that often environmental scientists certainly are much more ready to engage with creative artists and imaginative work than they are with traditional humanities disciplines, such as literature or history or theology. But saying that, I think that that model of kind of sharing authority across the disciplines, acknowledging fragility, laying aside expertise, but opening up to new knowledge, that's what's important for me.
Thank you.
You know, I was reminded listening to this of a German sociologist I met named Gunther Warsewa, and I can shoot you the name on email, but he might be worth interviewing for this project. He's made something of a career for himself as a consultant for waterfront neighborhoods in the aftermath of shipbuilding, things like that. But he has had some really interesting comments about community resilience and the way that communities perhaps cultivated a certain kind of creative spirit or perhaps entrepreneurial spirit that they then could apply to a new situation. But he also had some rather difficult examples to talk about. One community he consulted for was Gdansk, former Danzig in Poland. And part of the tug of war there is that politically, the solidarity movement was still dominating municipal politics, and they saw the closed shipyards as in some ways a shrine or a memorial to their cause. And outside consultants would come in and say, well, maybe you need a shopping mall, or maybe you need an aquarium to draw tourists, and there would be this disconnect. So also coming back to some of the points that Claire was making about the sometimes awkward conversations, who gets to speak in the room, who is listened to, whose needs are being met.
Thank you. And Alex Campbell in our conversation previously had some interesting points to make about capital and resilience, and how those two words sit together so often. So that would be an interesting thing to take up into the future. Willis?
So I want to come back to Claire's insightful comment that maybe environmental scientists aren't always as eager to work with humanities scholars as they are with the imaginative arts, and there's something of that in my experience as well. I think what has worked for us is where we are able to use the imaginative arts to identify some interpretive or normative question, like what is a coast, which came up earlier, really important question, and has complicated methodological and interpretive aspects to it. And then invite in humanities scholars to engage that in a way that is helpful, right? Because, you know, of course, we humanities scholars also have our own ways of making ourselves unhelpful by leading with, you know, constructiveness and historicity and complexity in a way that just like makes the scientists back off, right? So what we have done basically is use arts and art-based processes to open scholarly conversations to broad questions, even fundamental normative and political questions, that then I think creates a space in which everyone can engage those questions and real scholarship around them, including also non-scholarly publics, in a way that I think is at least less initially alienating. Now, I mean, I think then the question is it as helpful and clear as it should be, because it's also very open-ended. And anyway, I'll just leave it at that. But I would say that that's certainly something that we have thought about in our lab. And the most successful humanities scholars we've had, the most successful humanities-based projects we've had, have been ones who have really engaged with that. And I just want to lift up my colleague in Spanish, Charlotte Rogers. She does Caribbean studies. She's a comparative literature person, very conventional humanities approach. But through this lab, she totally changed her whole project to create basically an art exhibit in which she invited artists from around the Caribbean who had responded to recent hurricanes in a certain way to create a collective exhibit. And it was such a powerful scholarly event that then allowed her to draw out these themes that she knew would be present from her own literary work. And it just had an impact well beyond what a book project would have had she done that.
Thank you all. The book I have in mind at the moment now, especially after Claire's comment about fragility, which relates to some of the conversations we had in other previous groups about embodiment and thinking about swimming and about being in the water at this time of pandemic and injustice, to think about a book like It's Swim Two Boys by Jamie O'Neill, where a different kind of sovereignty is found in the air, in the shore. And there are ways, I suppose, in which we're thinking here about scholarly futurities and community alliances and partnerships that sometimes, again, the literature, as with Mangan, has been ahead of us. I admire you all a great deal. I have, as always, learned a great deal from speaking with you today. I'm very grateful that you have been with us, and thank you all.
Thank you.